Welcome to Timeless with Vivek Nittoor. Our guest today is Sharachchandra Lele. Sharachchandra Lele is a distinguished fellow in environmental policy and governance at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, ATREE. Sharad's research interests include conceptual issues in sustainable development and sustainability, and analysis of institutional, economic, ecological, and technological issues in forest, energy, and water resource management. He attempts to incorporate strong interdisciplinarity in his own research and teaching, which straddles ecology, economics, and political science. He is equally committed to bridging knowledge action divide through his work in policy making bodies, partnership with action groups, and outreach to the wider public. Sharad earned a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay in 1984, MS in System Science from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore in 1987, and Ph.D. in Energy and Resources from the University of California, Berkeley in 1993. After his Ph.D., he spent a year at the Pacific Institute for Studies in Development, Environment and Security, Oakland, as a senior research associate, and a year at Harvard University before returning to Bangalore to work in collaboration with the Institute for Social and Economic Change, and eventually being involved in the founding of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Environment and Development, CISED, in 2001. He was the coordinator of CISED for 8 years, and following CISED's merger with ATREE, he is now with ATREE. Hi Sharad, how have you been?
Hi Vivek, I've been great. Well, as much as lockdown permits, but doing fine. Thanks.
So Sharad, what was your childhood like? I think you have moved to a lot of places in your childhood. Were there any specific childhood events that could have triggered a lifelong interest in environmental science?
So you're right, Vivek, that I really moved around a lot, and that had to do with the fact that my father was in the Navy. So I was born in Pune, then went to Khadakwasla, then went to Delhi, and eventually Jamnagar before my father retired and came back to Pune. I think this itinerant childhood, so-called, had two impacts. One is that it prepared me for being more interdisciplinary in the long run, because I think it exposed me to different places, different languages. I learned Gujarati when I was in Jamnagar for 5 years in school and around in the city. So I think it really opened my mind to learning new things, new cultures. And certainly the time I spent in Jamnagar, which was a very formative period of my childhood, from my second to my sixth standards, exposed me to a lot of nature, because the naval base is right out on Rosie Island, and we were surrounded by a thorn forest. We had deer in the forest. We had jackals howling at night. So it was. I didn't really think about it. It was just part of life, right? Probably the turning point for me came in my 12th standard, so slightly later in high school. I had already been introduced to hiking and trekking as part of my 8th, 9th, 10th sort of schooling through an enthusiastic teacher who took us trekking in the Sahyadris. But in 12th standard, I was pushed to attend a nature camp, which I was kind of not really psyched about initially. But the nature camp was an absolute eye-opener for me. It was run by Bombay Natural History Society in the Khadakwasla campus of NDA. And just, we had Salim Ali show up for a day. We had other kinds of very enthusiastic naturalists who gave us hands-on training on how to do bird watching. And just the idea that you could go cycling to Molamutha Sanctuary in the middle of Pune city, just beyond Bund Garden Pool, and sit on the rocks. And in the span of maybe half an hour, you could see 30 different species of birds that I had never seen before in my life or noticed around me. It's just phenomenal, because these were migrant wading and water birds that came during December. So, the idea that there's nature all around us, there are birds all around us that we completely ignore or oblivious to, was absolutely an eye-opener. And that brought me firmly into the area of sort of wildlife and bird watching as a hobby, as a something that I would do always on the side. So that was definitely a turning point for me in my childhood.
It's completely amazing to learn that you saw 30 species of birds in 30 minutes.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yes.
And later on, when I would sit in my balcony in my house in a nice part of Pune, Deccan Gymkhana, and we had a park in front of us. And I would then start documenting what birds I saw and start identifying them from Salim Ali's Book of Indian Birds. And it was again amazing that just from the balcony, I had over about a year compiled list of 35 bird species, which were different completely from the birds that I had seen in the Muramutha Sanctuary, and somewhat different from the birds that I had seen in the NDA campus. So, I mean, the amount of bird life, I think even today, around in and around Pune, is just amazing. And that tells you that we are not really very far away from nature if we just open our eyes, and then we can think of ways in which to keep that nature alive.
Sharad, could you please tell our viewers about your days at H5 and IIT Bombay?
Sure. I think the IIT experience was another kind of really mind-blowing experience for me, because you're getting away from home. You're a teenager. I was really young when I entered the IIT campus, and the IIT campus is really special. IIT Bombay is probably the specialist of all the 5 IITs that were there around then. It's a really beautiful campus. So right from day one, I was doing bird watching and walking around the campus, enjoying the sort of natural beauty. It's also a time when your mind is being opened up to a whole bunch of new ideas and experiences. Right, you're being ragged. You're doing freshers dramatics. You have all kinds of facilities at your disposal, and of course, you're being grilled in the classroom or in the tutorial room. For instance, we had KD Joshi as our maths tutor, and so his maths tutorials were like absolutely stunning. You think this was the 5-year BTech program, so we thought entering the program, we'd already done 12th standard maths, integral and differential calculus, and all that. And then you enter, and the MA 101 starts with limits and differentials. And you think you have understood limits a long time ago, but then KD Joshi opens your eyes and shows that you understood nothing, and you really need to start from scratch. So both at the intellectual level, in terms of, I think, new ideas and experiences, you're living in a hostel which has a lot of autonomy. You've got excellent gymkhana facilities. I mean, in those days, this is 1980, the government was spending 15,000 rupees per student, and we were paying a tuition fee of 300 rupees per year, right? So that's the kind of subsidized and highly supportive environment that we had, with all kinds of facilities at our disposal. So it was absolutely fantastic 5 years that I spent there. I think I was really lucky also that I joined the H5, which happened to have a very large contingent of my batchmates, the 790 batch, and incredibly enthusiastic gang of people. So, again, willing to engage in all kinds of activities, including hiking and trekking and music and birding. I introduced birding to a lot of my friends, and they have stayed with that now over many years. I still get Mahesh Mehndre, a very close friend of mine from my batch, is today an absolutely ace bird photographer, and he's pursuing that interest in Bangalore, now in Houston. And you should just see his Facebook page; it's just amazing. So yeah, I think my H5 was a very special 5 years. IIT was a very special 5 years for me.
So it's very fascinating to hear about how your interest in bird watching, wildlife, and trekking developed. So how did you find the time to be garden secretary and general secretary at H5, and yet manage to be the silver medalist of the E batch of 1984?
Well, as you know, I mean, we set a lot in store by grades and GPIs and so on. But frankly, when I entered IIT, I didn't get the department I wanted. I got civil engineering, and that was a bit of a letdown as far as I was concerned, because I just thought that I should be able to get a decent rank and get the department I wanted. And so for the first 2 years, I actually worked very hard on so-called academics. I was considered as a nerd. A lot of my wingmates who were much more senior to me would constantly tease me that I was, slogging away or mugging away and not really participating in each and everything that they were up to. And they were up to a lot of shenanigans. They were old. They were in the 6th year, some of them in the 7th year of IIT and so on. So I did a lot of trekking and hiking in the first couple of years. I joined the mountaineering club. I remember I did 10 hikes in my first year. I did a winter trek. So that was always there. But otherwise, I was kind of limiting my extracurricular activities, you can say, in order to focus on academics. At the end of year 2, I got a change of departments. I was able to get into electrical engineering. And I actually took a very conscious decision that I didn't want to be in the academic rat race. a lot of my friends were telling me, "Oh, you're number 2 in electrical. You should be competing to get the silver medal or whatever, gold medal or whatever it was. The sort of normal expectations that people have." And I thought about it, and I took a very conscious decision that I don't want to stay or be part of the academic rat race. I mean, grades are important, and maybe, or learning whatever I'm here to learn is important, but really I don't want to get stuck in that rat race. And I decided that I want to really explore other things in IIT. And so I became a garden secretary in my 3rd year, general secretary in my 4th year, and then again went back to being a garden secretary in my 5th year out of my passion for nature, in a sense. And I think that was the right decision, because it gave me an understanding of social dynamics by being general secretary, for instance, of a hostel, which was a very tempestuous hostel in so many ways. The mess workers movement was very strong in our hostel. A lot of controversies, a lot of fights. So the understanding of how one lives in a community, how a community can be self-governed, what are the challenges in being a self-governed community, I think that gave me a really fascinating insight into those angles of wider social life. And I think there were several of us who felt that we should not be in the academic rat race. My colleague from my batch, Sharachchandra, who's now a faculty in computer science in IIT Bombay, I remember he was on the student council. So he and I had a pact. Since both were in the student council, me as general secretary and he as a counselor, we knew that this work would cut into our academics. And so we had a pact that he would attend one course and I would attend the other course. And we would take notes and keep carbon copies for each other and share those copies of the notes and work with those notes. So that's kind of the sort of the cooperative spirit as against a more competitive spirit that is traditionally honed in the IIT context, right? When you're talking about relative grading and so on and so forth. So you're really constantly thinking about your competition. But I think being part of this network of people who are doing other stuff meant that we had to cooperate with each other when it came to academics. And so that was also part of how I managed to balance these things. And as I said, I wasn't really competing for the silver medal. It just so happened that my grades remained good, and it sort of somehow ended up being a silver medal serendipitously in some sense. My real interests were really in this wider set of things that I was doing.
Sharad, I was surprised to learn that you had 2 stints at being garden secretary at H5.
Right. There used to be a gag question that freshies would be asked when I was in my final year, or in my 4th year. The freshies would be asked, "So Sharad was, and will be GSEC," and explain. So that was the joke that was going around, because I was garden general and then garden again. I think that was just sort of sheer passion for. In my first stint as a garden secretary, I had built up a rose garden. We had created a rose garden in one of the wings of the, not wings, in one of the plots in the hostel. And I guess I didn't want to see it sort of go down the drain in some sense. So I was really trying to keep that effort up and maybe groom a next person who would take over after that. I mean, these are all very silly things in hindsight, but one gets attached to some of the things that one creates.
What were the key moments in the journey towards environmentalism?
When I entered IIT, I wasn't sure what I was really doing. I mean, I to be very honest, like many of us who join engineering, we just think, well, that's one of the things that is available. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor. I mean, as a typical middle class, very narrow mindset, options that parents present in front of you, engineering, medical. My father was an engineer, so it sort of seemed normal that I should also gravitate towards engineering. But I didn't really know what engineering involved, what it was really all about. I think kids today have a better idea of the idea of it. It's not just engineering, it's technology, it's innovation. I think they have a slightly better idea of what this whole thing is about. So I kind of wandered into IIT, and wildlife, mountaineering, these were hobbies that I was pursuing on the side, right? But in my 3rd or 4th year, I'm trying to remember exactly when, I remember Sushil Borkar was the wildlife secretary from my batch. And we used to go to the Gymkhana, because there was a small Gymkhana library above the weightlifting room or something like that. And they had a really good collection of wildlife books. And in 82, they got a new book called the First Citizens Report on State of India's Environment. This was published by the new Center for Science and Environment, led by Anil Agarwal. And it was a fantastic eye-opener for me, because this was a book on the environment, but written in a much broader canvas. And it showed me that actually my idea of wildlife and birding and so on was just a small slice of the environmental problem, or the environmental interactions that human beings have. And this book had a chapter on land, water, energy, forests, air pollution, habitat, uh, and then one on biodiversity, right? So it sort of showed that the environment is everything around us. Is the air we breathe, the water we drink, the electricity that comes into your light bulb when you turn it on, is coming from some environmental process, either a big hydropower dam where the water has been dammed and is gushing down some pipes, or a coal thermal power plant, or a nuclear energy plant. And all of these are really environmental processes. You're modifying the environment all the time in doing all this stuff. So it completely changed my perspective on how, where I am vis-a-vis the environment. I'm not just somebody who goes out and does bird watching. That's not the only thing. And I think pretty much after reading this book, and we discussed this book a lot. I remember having debates with Sushil and others, what it really meant and so on. I think at that point I realized that this is what I wanted to do. And that could be a combination of finding that thing, and of course having been a little bit disillusioned with IIT engineering. And by disillusioned, I mean not because the teaching was not great and so on. I think we had some of the best teachers ever, especially in electrical engineering. But it has to do with seeing what was happening to earlier batches, right? 30% would go abroad, get a master's, settle down in the US, never come back. Another 30% would take the CAT or whatever it was, and go to the IIMs, do an MBA, and then become finance guys or marketing guys, or I don't know, whatever else, managers. They were not doing engineering either. It was really a travesty of this whole idea that the nation had invested in IITs in order to produce the engineers that would serve the country. And I was wondering, like, where is the service to the country here? The government is investing so much money in us. We're getting some of the best teachers, the best campus, the best facilities. And what are we doing with it, right? We're just going abroad. And brain drain was an active conversation then, but everybody said that that's what I want to do. I want to take the GRE and buzz off, because that's where all the opportunities are. So I think that really cheesed me off. It really made me feel that I'm cheating, my country in some sense. But I couldn't figure out what to do about it till I discovered the idea of environmental studies as something much broader than wildlife or bird watching. And so that's pretty much when I think in my fourth year I decided that I wanted to do environmental studies. How I managed to make that transition is, again, a series of serendipitous events.
Sharad, was there an element of environmentalism in your BTech project that you did with Professor Parmar?
Oh, absolutely. Because I think by the time I chose my BTech project, this was the end of the fourth year, right? Beginning of the fifth year, I was very clear that I didn't want to do conventional electrical engineering. I was also fairly clear that I didn't want to go abroad and do all the sort of, jazzy stuff. At that time, the hot thing was digital circuits or, VLSI and stuff like that. So then I was looking for a bridge between electrical engineering and my interest in environmental studies. And I saw Professor Parmar's topic was electricity and energy conservation. And I said, okay, fine, this is a good link. And I remember, because I think that it's a bit silly, but the process of picking BTech projects is very hierarchical I don't know if it's still the same, but in my days it was hierarchical. So the top ranked CPI holder would get the first choice. And I was the top ranked student at that point. So there's a whole bunch of interesting topics according to conventional ideas of interesting that were put up by Professor Vasi, by Professor Sahasrabudhe, and so on and so forth. And here I was choosing a topic in the boring area of power engineering, which Professor Parmar represented, and that too something called lighting and energy conservation. I think everybody just started looking at me like, what? Was I joking or what? Because here's the top guy in the department picking this incredibly boring and offbeat topic. But that I had already decided by then that I was not going to be doing engineering. I wanted to do environmental studies. So that, and I think it was a good decision, because in the process I learned a bunch of things about energy, about energy economics, how do we measure conservation or efficiency, and so on and so forth. Professor Parmar's elective on substations and transmission line design also introduced me to sort of basic engineering economics that stayed with me till much later, including my master's. So yeah, that was definitely a stepping stone to moving out of electrical engineering. The second stepping stone, or the way I was able to do the moving out process, I was lucky that Professor Madhava Gadgil from the Indian Institute of Science, as you know, one of India's topmost ecologists, came to IIT and gave a lecture in the lecture theatre. And after his lecture, I went up to him and said, look, I really want to work in the field of environment. Can you help me figure it out, or can you tell me how I can do that? And he said, come to the Indian Institute of Science, we'll figure something out. I don't know if you have met Madhav ever, but Madhav is a very, very open-minded and bindas kind of person. So come, we'll figure it out. So I guess obviously he saw my passion. There was no easy pathway, however, because the Center for Ecological Sciences that he founded didn't exist at that point. He set it up in 85. I was graduating in 84. So willy-nilly, I applied to the School of Automation, given my electrical engineering background, because Madhav put me in touch with a professor there who was interested in hydropower and its environmental impacts. So one of the good things about the Institute of Science is that it's a very open place. Faculty have a huge amount of leeway and autonomy to essentially guide students in whatever area they want, even if they are in the department of automation or whatever. So he was interested in these questions of energy, hydropower, and environment. And so he agreed to guide me. And so that's how I made the transition from electrical engineering through lighting and energy conservation into the question of big dams.
So Sharad, how was your stay at the Indian Institute of Science? Could you also please talk about your master's thesis?
Sure. So Indian Institute of Science was quite a contrast to IIT Bombay, right? Half the size of students, probably a 10-year gap between the average ages. So they are much older. They are doing PhDs, so they're really worried about PhD or uske baad mein naukri milna hai, ye wo. So people are much more serious. They're there for like 6 years, sometimes 7 years doing PhDs. That energy level of the 18-year-old entering IIT, 18 to 22 has diminished to an extent. So initially found it a very dull and boring place. So we decided to liven it up. So I was involved in restarting the Spic McKay chapter of Bangalore. There were some enthusiastic friends in IIM Bangalore. In fact, Samir Kumar, also my batchmate from electrical engineering H6, he had joined IIM Bangalore for an MBA. So he got in touch with me. He had been involved in Spic McKay in IIT Bombay. So we decided we had to revive the Bangalore chapter. And so that was one almost at some point a full-time extracurricular activity of organizing music programs and so on and so forth. I also did a lot of birding, and IIC campus, again, a great campus in terms of greenery. And of course, from Bangalore, you can go to various other places. So we did a bit of hiking, trekking, bicycling expeditions, and all that kind of stuff. IIC campus, although quiet, of course, has its own, as I said, advantages. And the freedom that I got as a student, I took some core courses in the School of Automation, but then I was able to, as an MSc by research, I was able to do this topic, which was on hydropower dams. And the question that was posed to me by my advisor was, how do we know that the choice made for the size of a particular dam is the right choice? And is there a way that we can sort of open up that question? And so I learned hydrology, or rather I learned how hydrological data are used in the design of dams through a course in civil engineering. I, in fact, ended up writing then a paper on which improves upon an algorithm that was being used by the dam engineers at that point in time. That was my first quote-unquote academic publication. And then I incorporated the costs of submerging land. As you build a bigger dam, you have more land being lost, more people being displaced, or more forest being submerged. So how do you factor in those costs into that? And I was able to get data for two dams, one a proposed dam in the Western Ghats of Karnataka called Bedti, and the other was an already built dam in Maharashtra, which is the Koyna Dam. And I was able to get some old DPRs, as they are called, detailed project reports, which are these big fat volumes, which are really the proposal for building the dam, the size and the economics of the whole thing, the costing is written into those big volumes. So I was able to get hold of these documents and these data sets and show that those dams had been, in a sense, suboptimally designed. And if we incorporated the submergence costs properly, you should have gone for a smaller dam. And in some cases, depending on the scenarios that you visualized, the discount rates, the time it took to build the dam, and so on and so forth, you might end up deciding not to build the dam at all. So I was applying environmental economics to the question of optimum sizing of dams, and that was my first introduction to not just economics but environmental economics. I remember taking a bus down to the Institute for Social and Economic Change. Professor M.B. Nadkarni is probably India's very earliest environmental economist, and he was at ISEC. So I went to meet him, and he gave me some basic textbooks and material on extended benefit cost analysis, as it is called, applying that benefit cost analysis in a wider societal, developmental, and environmental context. And that introduction to Professor Nadkarni was really, it was fortuitous, but it really was also life changing, because I went back to ISEC so many years later and had a really nice collaboration with him for many years. So many interesting sort of, again, serendipitous movements. I think one of the other serendipity events was realizing that although I had come to the Institute of Science with the idea of doing a PhD, I realized that the institute was not really set up to cater to my interests. They didn't have a program in environmental studies. In my second year at the institute, they launched a program in ecology, but I found the program a little too stifling. Maybe I was coming from an engineering background, and this was really basically biology stuff, and I didn't find that attractive enough. So I took a decision, a very conscious decision, to rethink my idea of not going to the US. I'd originally, thinking like in a very naive way कि अरे भाई अपने को तो इंडिया पे काम करना है, इंडियन एनवायरमेंटल प्रॉब्लम्स पे काम करना है, तो इसमें यूएस वालों से क्या सीखना है, so a very sort of nationalist perspective, you might say. But after my experience in my first year or so, I realized that I wouldn't get the kind of advising I would need for this, and so I decided to reapply to universities in the US. And it was sort of serendipitously maybe, or I was really lucky to get into UC Berkeley, and that again was a life-changing sort of event there.
Could you please tell us more about your days as a doctoral student at the University of California, Berkeley? Could you also please talk about your work there on definition, measurement, and causal analysis of sustainability in forest use as a part of the Western Ghat forests, which was the focus of your doctoral dissertation?
Sure. So as you can see, when I was leaving IIC, in some sense, the skills that I had were that of a bit of engineering and a bit of environmental economics. And so I went to the US to this particular program, Energy and Resources, with a very techno-economic mindset, that an understanding of technology and an understanding of economics is adequate to address any environmental problems that the technology creates, whether it's dams or whatever else. I was going there with the idea that I would expand my sort of work on dams to the broader landscape, because that was my examples of both dams, Koyna and BTech, came from the Western Ghats, and I know that's a very forested area. So I was kind of trying to expand that into the use of forests by people for firewood and looking at it from an energy perspective and so on. Energy was a big buzzword at that time. Professor Amulya Reddy, one of the absolute pioneers in energy studies in India, he was in the Indian Institute of Science. Unfortunately, I missed him because the year I went to IIC, he was on a sabbatical. But he came back, and so the work that he had done during his sabbatical is, published as a very famous set of books. And so energy was a big thing at that time. Energy crisis, energy shortages, the use of forests for energy, that is firewood, leading to deforestation. So this was the discourse, really, firewood causing deforestation. So that's kind of the background with which I went to the University of California at Berkeley. Again, to my sort of good fortune, the Energy and Resources group is an amazing group, even within UC Berkeley. I mean, Berkeley itself is a very fascinating campus with a very diverse set of faculty and so on. But the Energy and Resources group stands out even within this campus, because it's extremely interdisciplinary. Right from its sort of founding point, it has been dedicated to the idea that students need to understand environmental problems from multiple perspectives, for which they need to have training in multiple disciplines. And they started with a master's program and then expanded into a PhD program. And I went in thinking I would do this kind of a techno-economic analysis. Through much of my PhD career, I was still thinking of modeling the behavior of people vis-a-vis forests and how they use forests for their livelihoods and so on in a sort of mathematical modeling, bioeconomic modeling kind of sense. Berkeley gave me the flexibility of doing my PhD fieldwork in India, and Professor Madhav Gadgil was my host here. So I was actually based in the CES field station. The Center for Ecological Sciences had a field station in Shirsi in Uttar Kannada district of the Western Ghats. And that gave me an amazing exposure to the reality of how people in the Western Ghats are living their lives, sort of in that interface of agriculture and forests. And because of my good fortune, being based in the Institute of Sciences field station, having access to data already they had collected, and adding my own observations and so on, I had a huge data set, and I thought, oh, I can do this modeling of how people use the forest, how if you introduce chulas or biogas, that will change their use of the forest, and the dynamics of the whole thing. When I actually sat down to write the dissertation or analyze the data, I realized that we didn't understand this interface very well. You can't model a system unless you have some basic understanding of what are the factors at play there. And I realized that we didn't really understand it very well. And the first thing I struggled a lot was, what do we mean by forest degradation? So the standard discourse of deforestation and degradation caused by human beings who go in for grazing, who go in for firewood collection, and activists and people living there gave me a very different perspective. They say, why do you call this a degraded forest? This is a good forest. It is a very productive forest that gives us what we want. And I think that really that bulb really went off when I realized that the idea of forest degradation is actually a social construct. And I won't get too far onto my pet hobby horse about what is social construction and so on. But the idea is that you cannot define what is a good forest or a bad forest without having a value lens. You have a lens about, for example, the forester looks at it from a timber perspective and says, oh, this is a pretty useless forest because it's got all these species which are lousy timber species. So I want to convert it into a teak plantation. And in that sense, for the forester, a teak plantation is a good forest. And an evergreen forest which doesn't have good quality timber species is not such a great forest. For an ecologist, on the other hand, that evergreen forest, so-called pristine, diversity of species, that's kind of the epitome of a good forest, right? Climax. So ecology for a long time has been stuck in this notion of ecosystems moving gradually towards a climax. And for them, the evergreen forests on the crestline of the Western Ghats are climax ecosystems. So those are the good forests, and everything else is degraded. But for the villager, for instance, a productive forest is a good forest, and production for the villager is not timber because they are anyway not given right to timber. They want firewood, they want grazing material, they want green manure for their agriculture, they want leaf litter because they use a lot of leaf litter for mulching. They want non-timber forest products, like honey or medicinal plants, which they can actually harvest. So there's no pristineness concept there. It is about forests for daily use, for making a livelihood, which is complementary to agriculture, for grazing your animals. So that forest will never look like a pristine forest. They will all at the same time not want it to be a teak plantation because the teak plantation is useless when it comes to these daily requirements of the villagers. So they had a third perspective on what is a good forest, which was very different. And there is no way to reconcile them. It's actually better to acknowledge that each comes with its own set of values. What is important? There are a set of interests. And accordingly, you define what is a good forest. So degradation then is only definable with respect to this idea of a good forest. So you could in fact say a teak plantation is a degraded forest as far as the villager is concerned, and also as far as the ecologist is concerned. Whereas a teak plantation is great as far as the forester is concerned. So this is the first, in a sense, my first point in my dissertation, that you need to understand the idea of forest degradation from these multiple perspectives, and then decide which perspective are you going to use to evaluate what's happening to the forest. Because you cannot assess without having a perspective. And I decided very explicitly in the dissertation that I wanted to evaluate the forest in terms of was it being used vis-a-vis in the most optimal way vis-a-vis the villagers' interests. And that included the question of sustainability. So if they wanted as a firewood forest or as a firewood plus grazing plus mulching kind of forest, will this last? The way they are managing that forest for meeting those needs, will it last over time? So you can talk about sustainability only vis-a-vis an objective. If you want to have teak timber production from that forest, the sustainability question becomes: will this teak plantation last over time, or will it fall prey to disease or soil erosion or something else, right? So then the question came: how do I evaluate sustainability of this forest use and management? And there I again discovered that the methods, the in a sense, the criteria that people had been using were unfortunately colored by their own perspectives of what is a good forest. And so they would use criteria which were not appropriate for the kind of use that these forests were being put to by the villagers. So I then sort of revised the criteria and applied them with the data I had. And then I found, lo and behold, what we thought were degrading forests were really a mixture of forests in actually sustainable use and some amount of degradation, where people were not able to control the amount of pressure they were putting on the forest. So it was a much more mixed story. It was no longer a story of these villagers, they are using too much firewood, they are doing too much grazing, and that's leading to degradation, which is sort of your standard Malthusian myth about environmental degradation. And in fact, it looked like a lot of the forests were under very good management, but from the management from the villagers' perspective. And now my third question then was, what explains this mixture of good management and bad management, or sustainable and unsustainable use? And so I did a sort of household economic model, you can say econometrics, to understand that, saying what are those constraints or characteristics of the household that might explain what's going on in the landscape. And it was clear to me that some households had rights to the forest, others didn't have rights. So those who had rights were able to actually put up a fence and exclude others from using that patch of forest. So those forests were in better shape because they could really control what was going on in the forest. Whereas the middle and lower class villagers didn't have rights over forest. This is a legacy of the British period. And therefore they were confined, they were using forests in an open access form, and the forests were degrading because nobody was able to tell each other what should or should not be done in the forest. So the nature of property rights, the nature of household endowments that the villagers have, and the unfortunate coincidence of the two, where the economically well-off were also the ones who had secure rights to the forest, meant that the economically well-off were not necessarily degrading the forest. They were heavy users of the forest, but still using it sustainably, whereas the others may not be even using it so heavily, but were confined to much smaller patches with no control over those patches. So that's the kind of insight I got from my PhD dissertation, and I call it sort of the philosophy, ecology, and you can say the socioeconomics of forest use. Because unless you understand these philosophical questions of what is a good forest, what is a degraded forest, I think you might often end up on the wrong track. And that question has stayed with me forever, which is what do we consider a good environment?
Sharad, it was very interesting to know that what were earlier considered as degraded forests were really mixed, as per the new criteria. And when you saw it from the viewpoint of the villagers and the viewpoint of ecology, this is very interesting. Is there a greater alignment between the villagers' view of the forest and the ecologists' view of the forest?
That's a very good question. I think that's true up to a point. And it depends on which ecologist you're talking to. Somebody like Madhav, who was really open to this question of how does that, diversity exist, and that diversity in ecosystems has co-evolved with human beings. It's not something that was always there, and human beings is always being, the degrading force, which is a very common view amongst many ecologists. So Madhav is a much more sort of co-evolutionary kind of guy. The idea that human beings have fostered diversity, have fostered ecosystems. Their traditions have, in some sense, sustained the diversity of their traditions has also created and sustained diversity in ecosystems, is a very strong idea for him. And so I think it really depends upon how one is looking at ecology, right? Because if one is always thinking of pristine systems as the best, then almost by definition, I mean, you don't have to go and investigate anything, because you know that if people are wandering around in the forest collecting firewood or grazing animals, those systems are not pristine. That's true by definition. And if you assume that pristine systems are the best, then what people are doing, or people used forests are not good, not the best. Whereas if you look at the reality, if you take a particular criterion such as diversity, so one of the first students from the Center for Ecological Sciences, Ranjit Daniels, an outstanding biologist, ecologist, bird watcher in particular. He did his PhD on birds of the Western Ghats in the same area that I was doing my PhD work. His work was looking at the gradient of diversity across the landscape between quote unquote relatively undisturbed, relatively pristine forests, forests which are heavily used by people, and then also the agricultural landscape. And lo and behold, he found that in fact the highest bird diversity was often in the middle parts, which is forests that are used by people, which are on the fringe of agriculture. So you get birds from, in a sense, both ecotones, the pristine ecotone and the agricultural ecotone. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, as it is called in ecology, in at least in that case, seems to hold. So I think that's some of the complexities that we need to be always alert to, that both our ideas of what is a good forest. See, one of the problems is we put something on a pedestal, and then we decide that everything else has to fit that expectation. So now we have a whole generation of new ecologists who have accepted that one doesn't have to work in pristine systems. It's called disturbance ecology. They are interested in doing disturbance ecology. You have somebody like Vidya Atreya who is working in Maharashtra and pointing out that leopards are actually really enjoying themselves in agricultural fields and are able to coexist with human beings in many parts of Maharashtra without really creating any major havoc. And then even people are willing to tolerate a certain amount of, sheep or goat that the leopard lifts, or dogs actually that leopards love to eat. People are tolerant of that because of their tradition of coexistence. And if one is willing to sort of broaden one's mindset, it need not be that tigers can only be preserved in these so-called pristine habitats where no human being ever enters. Because then, of course, the question is, if you didn't enter there, how would you even take those lovely National Geographic movies, right? So I think there is a certain rethinking that's going on amongst ecologists about this whole idea of pristineness, and that's really welcome.
Sharad, could you please talk about the people who have influenced you the most in your life?
So I would say there have been a whole number of inspiring people. And at the same time, I've also been notorious in terms of, interacting, picking ideas from them, and then kind of moving on. So I don't think I can think of one person who has influenced me forever in some sense. It's been people who have sort of nudged me, pushed me, even in a sense, aggressively sort of criticized me in ways that has made me rethink, right? So there are a whole bunch of different influences, right? From my school teacher who introduced me to hiking, or Vijay Paranspe, a well-known environmentalist in Pune, who forced me to go to that nature camp. And in a sense, really, that was a turning point for me, and that was because of his wanting younger people to be exposed to nature in some sense. So his influence, or Madhav Gadgil's influence, huge influence in terms of his perspective on this co-evolutionary view of people and nature. Madhav's co-author Ramachandra Guha, who's well known as an environmental historian, one would say he pioneered the field of environmental history in India. He has been a huge influence for me, because I was at IIC when he was just finishing his PhD and spending a year at IIC in 84, 85. And then we met again in Berkeley and so on. And we have stayed in touch ever since, because he's based in Bangalore. And his work on kind of understanding environmentalism has been absolutely outstanding and really influenced me a lot in my thinking about environmentalism. Faculty at Berkeley, my advisor Richard Norgard, again, it's very interesting. I've never used his theories. He's an environmental economist, or rather an ecological economist. He's a founder of the International Society for Ecological Economics. I never really directly used his methods or techniques or theories in my work, but his influence in terms of ideas of openness, his philosophical interest in questions of how we do interdisciplinary work, have sort of stayed with me, have really influenced me a lot. And Professor Nadkarni's work at the Institute of Science, Social and Economic Change in Bangalore, ISEC. As I said, he was one of the first environmental economists in the country. And he helped me, he became a trustee of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Environment and Development, CISED, that I set up on the ISEC campus. And sort of the kind of support that he provided just by being there, Professor Jagadish, Indian Institute of Science, also became a trustee of this center. and the exposed bricks that you see behind me. So this is compressed mud block technology that Professor Jagdish devised as part of his work in Astra. Astra was the Center for Application of Science and Technology to Rural Areas. It was set up by Professor Amulya Reddy in the Institute of Science. Professor Jagdish was one of the first faculty to sort of become part of that center and go really all out in terms of looking at. Professor Jagdish is a civil engineer, so he looked at construction materials and construction material technology and came up with this idea of compressed mud blocks which do not require any burning. So as you know, normal bricks are burnt in brick kilns, and that consumes a lot of firewood. So again, going back to this firewood causing deforestation discourse, can we create bricks without firewood? And so he created the compressed mud block technology. So those influences have been just, I mean, it's hard to sort of pin them down to one particular thing they said, but this is the presence of some of these people. And I think I have to also mention a couple of other influences in my life, which is first the most perhaps life-changing event in my stay at the Institute of Science is that I met my wife, my future wife, Prajwal Shastri, who is an astrophysicist and an intellectual in her own right. But also by being that, she's been a huge influence in terms of the challenging me to look at the equity side of the story. So she comes from a very strong commitment to social justice and equity in her upbringing, and I came from a more environmentalist background. So I see that as the sort of the fight between the green and the red, and there's been a huge influence in terms of my own thinking on these issues. And my work ever since has been to look for a synthesis between green and red, and that's been really part of my journey. And finally, the school that my kids went to, the Center for Learning in Bangalore, it's a sort of a alternative school inspired by J. Krishnamurti's philosophy. And the one big thing that sort of I would like to share here is the contrast between the spirit that I think either unconsciously or maybe even consciously gets fostered in IITs, which is the competitive spirit, right? And I think there's a certain belief that why do you give grades? Because you want students to strive harder, right? And you think that by telling them that they were not good enough to get an A and they got a B or a C, they will work harder to get an A the next time in the next course or something like that. So, or if they compete and they have a 6 CPI and somebody else has an 8 CPI or whatever, they'll kind of push them to excel. So you are saying that for learning we need competition, and Center for Learning believes exactly the opposite. They believe that learning is possible to be fostered in kids without competition, without reward and punishment. No corporal punishment, no punishment at all, and no reward, no first place, no second place, no marks, no grades. So till 10th standard, they don't have any exams. And that's a completely different mindset. And I think that's been a real life changer for me also in terms of understanding these questions of learning, of living life, actually, the idea of democratic structures in the teachers community and so on. So that's being also a huge influence. Again, not necessarily one individual, but that place. We have engaged with that place for 19 years. Our 2 children graduated from that school, and it's been a phenomenal experience by itself. And I think it's influenced me in the way I've come to look at institution building, the questions of learning and so on in my own life.
That was very fascinating to hear, Sharad. And I am surprised and yet not surprised to know that the bricks in your house are environmentally sustainable and have been built in an environmentally sound manner. And I was also very interested to hear about how your interest became wider after you met your wife at the Indian Institute of Science. So are there any professors at IIT Bombay who influenced you in a very significant way?
I mean, I have some really, very nice memories of learning from Professor Agashe. As you know, he had broad interests. He's one of the guys with really broad interests. He's one of the few faculty who came for my colloquium at IIT Bombay 30 years later when I gave it in Sitara. And his first course that I took was actually Logic and Fundamentals of Mathematics, right? And the passion with which he taught it, the beauty with which he sort of exposed us to those ideas was just phenomenal. And I ended up taking I think the maximum number of courses I took in IIT Bombay were with Professor Agashe. Sort of serendipitously, there was one course on linear system theory. We didn't have anybody to teach it in that particular semester. The students sort of campaigned and forced him to teach it. So he said he would not teach it. We had to do self-learning, and he would only run quizzes. And then he came up with this idea that if you failed the first quiz, then you have to go back and take it once again. And it was only after you cleared the first quiz that you could take the second quiz. Okay. So unfortunately, the idea boomeranged on him, because by the end of the semester, he was still writing, preparing question papers for quiz number 1, for some stragglers for quiz number 2, quiz number 3, and so on. So at the end of the day, he was really fed up with the idea that he had himself created. But the way that course went was completely self-taught, right? So we had a textbook and we had quizzes, and we had to learn it all ourselves. Or Professor Vasi's open notes exams, right? He gave a nice explanation as to why he didn't want them to be open book, because he said that if I let it be open book, you'll bring these stacks of books, and then when you see the question, you'll be just going back and forth across 200 pages looking for the answer. And I don't want that to happen. So you can bring anything you can fit onto 2 sides of paper. But also, I mean, that is just by the way, in a sense. The real thing about Professor Vasi or Professor Agashe was their passion for teaching, the quality of the teaching that they brought, and Professor Vasi's case, sort of the ideas of open learning, that you're learning things yourself. You set up a lab. You don't give predefined set of experiments. You work it out yourself. And so he gave us marks for having tried to figure out something during the experiment ourselves, rather than or designed a new test or a new measurement ourselves, rather than for having got it right, got the correct number, whatever it was, the resistance or the capacitance that we were measuring, or whatever it was, right? He was actually transistor circuits. So I think that these were memories of teaching. The unfortunate part for me, you can say, is that I learned from some of the best teachers of electrical engineering, but never used it in my life, right? But I think I'm sure a lot of that stayed indirectly, because it's about the analytical abilities, rigorous thinking, questioning. I think those basic ideas have stayed with me forever.
It was very nice to hear about Professor Agashe and Professor Vasi. As you're aware, both these professors have been interviewed as part of the Timeless series.
Yes. So it's a bit of it's a huge honor for me to be lined up in the same series as Professor Agashe and Professor Vasi, I must say that.
So Sharad, could you please talk about your work on water management and forest hydrology over the years? Could you also please talk about the Vrishabhavati River in Bengaluru, which has been used as a sewer for a long time, and how can this situation be fixed? And could you also please talk about your Arkavati work and the award-winning paper on Arkavati?
So that's been a bit of a segue in my work. For the first, I should say, since my PhD days, I started working on the forest question in India, and that stayed with me throughout. Today, I'm deeply involved in that question. But one of the claims that are made about forests is that forests are good because they regulate rivers. They provide some kind of a smoothened out flow between monsoon and summer, and so on and so forth. So they did the sort of nice description of forests as sponges which absorb rainwater and then let it out slowly during the summer. So this has been a claim, or certain, you could say, a environmentalist myth making about forests for a while. Not a whole lot of data. And in fact, there was a school of sort of, you can say, renegade forest hydrologists in the US who claimed that was completely bunkum. Forests actually consume a lot of water because they transpire water for their growth. So they're consuming water; they're not really adding water in any sense. And I think that's true. So one of the environmentalist myths you will see this perpetuated often is that forests create water, forests produce rivers. This is just a sort of correlation becoming causation kind of thing. Forests are located in areas of high rainfall, especially in a country like India, where everything else has been covered by agriculture. So forests are located in the hilly terrain and areas of high rainfall, and so obviously the rivers originate in those areas because that's where the high rainfall is. It doesn't mean the forests are creating that river, and the forest sustaining effect can be more of sort of this regulation, that they will consume water for evapotranspiration, but their roots will also enable the seepage of water into the ground, the infiltration process, and therefore you will get a slower release during the summer through groundwater, the base flows. So we decided to actually take up a study on that, and that was my first introduction to hydrology after my PhD days. After my master's work on sort of dams, which was more theoretical, more based on secondary data. So here we actually went to the field, set up V notches with my hydrology colleagues, measured flow in the streams using current meters, and tried to calculate the flow in the stream and so on and so forth over the year. And we found something very interesting, that it really depended on how water was being used downstream of the forest. So the contrast was that in the southern part of Karnataka, where we looked at streams coming out of Bandipur National Park, villagers have over centuries evolved the technology of what are called minor irrigation tanks, which are these small reservoirs they have built on streams. And irrigation is used for irrigated farming, in the command area of these tanks. Now, if you have that kind of a tank, you really want the tank to fill up fast, because by the end of June, the villagers want to take a call as to whether they can do irrigated paddy crop in the Kharif season, or they have to take a ragi crop. And similarly, because it's a bimodal rainfall distribution, they get a second round of rainfall September, October, November. So they want to take a decision by early December as to whether they can take another irrigated paddy crop during the next season. And so they want the tank to fill early. And for that, you need a bit of a degraded forest. You don't want a very dense forest, which is transpiring a lot of water and is slowing down the runoff, is doing a lot of infiltration. We really want surface runoff into these tanks. So we actually showed that if you restore that forest to its quote-unquote pristine status, the agriculture in those particular downstream areas would suffer. This is not obviously the only consequence. There would be other consequences. Groundwater would be recharged. So if somebody else is using groundwater, they would benefit. So that kind of really got me interested in questions of water and hydrology and stuff like that. And then we did a very large project on urbanizing river basins using the case of Arkavati, Vrishbhavati in around Bangalore, and the Noyal River in Coimbatore. And the Arkavati paper is particularly interesting, the one that you mentioned that got an award with my colleague Meena Srinivasan and others. We asked the question, everybody is saying that the Arkavati River has dried up. And there is good data to show that over a 30, 40, 60-year period, the river's flows have become almost zero. And 10 years before our project, the ISRO had been given a consultancy to come up with explanations and come up with prescriptions and so on. And really, people were not actually testing hypotheses properly. So ISRO started with a 10-fold hypothesis and ended up with the same hypothesis, saying this is also possible, that is also possible. So we explored that question very rigorously and found out that it was not climate change that could explain the decline, because if at all anything, rainfall had only increased marginally, or it was on an average constant. Secondly, it was not temperature changes. Temperature had increased a little bit, but it wouldn't increase evapotranspiration a whole lot. So the explanation lay in two things primarily: the spread of eucalyptus in the catchment, where today it occupies 20% of the catchment area, and the use of groundwater by people, both of which are basically depleting groundwater, which means there are no base flows. The groundwater levels never come up enough that they would empty into the stream channel at some point in the year. And that's basically why you have the river drying up. And this is, in a sense, why it's sort of been a very well-known paper, because we have started with 5 hypotheses and tested them and come to a conclusion as to which of them work, which don't work. The story of the Vrishbhavati, which very close to where I live, is a very different story. Whereas the Arkavati is drying, the Vrishbhavati is actually overflowing, because it's an urban river. It originates within Bangalore, and so what was originally a seasonal river has become perennial because it gets all of Bangalore sewage, or in this case, 40% of Bangalore sewage. Bangalore drains into 2 catchments. This is one of them. So the Vrishbhavati gets 40% of Bangalore's sewage water. And that's why over the years, as Bangalore has grown, its use of domestic water has grown, the use of industrial water has grown. So the effluents have also increased. And so this is really a perennially flowing river now. The downstream farmers at one level are very happy because they are able to take 3 crops instead of just a single crop. But, and there's the big but, that it's also sewage water, so it's highly polluted. And it's a combination of domestic pollutants and industrial pollutants. And so the work that we did with my colleague Priyanka Jamwal from ATREE, who's a water quality engineer from IIT Delhi. So she measured heavy metal concentrations in the river. So we first found heavy metals in the farmlands downstream and worked our way upstream to locate the sources. And we showed that contrary to what the Pollution Control Board was saying, the sources were still the industrial areas where small-scale industries are engaged in electroplating, smithy, a variety of such activities that involve dumping of effluents into the river. And her work, which was really, really daring work in some sense, was to put up a 24-hour monitoring system on the river, do it manually through the night, and found that all the peaks in the heavy metal concentrations were coming at night. So the industry know that during the day they would be monitored, or it would be visible as a blue colored or a red colored or a yellow colored discharge, and so they only do those discharges at night. You can just look at the bottle; you don't even have to measure the heavy metal concentrations. So then my work was to look at what was going on in terms of environmental regulation in the industrial areas, and I found that the Pollution Control Board really was completely sort of missing the wood for the trees in some sense. They were focusing on giving permits, but not focusing enough energies on random inspections, on testing, on monitoring the river. So a lot of our pollution law itself is written in a way that focuses on measuring at point of discharge, right? So tailpipe. So it's measuring your tailpipe emissions in some sense, not ambient air quality. Till they set up the ambient air quality standards very recently. So you could have 1,000 industrial units, each of them meeting concentration standards at their tailpipe, in this case, the water discharge point, but adding up enough pollutants in a river which is an urban river. So I think this is also part of the mentality that we've had, that rivers are these pristine, ever perennially flowing bodies into which you dump a little bit of pollutant. So, dilution is a solution to all pollution. So it will solve the problem. But when you have a river which is actually seasonal, and the most of the year the discharge in the river is really pollution, or the effluents. If the effluents are not sufficiently treated, you'll get a lot of pollution. And so we have sort of really tried to work with the Pollution Control Board to try to change their mindsets about how they should approach this problem. I mean, it's still a long way to go, but it's been a very fascinating experience in linking the heavy metal measurement work to the environmental governance questions. How is the Pollution Board doing its work? Why is it doing it the way it's doing it? What is the structure of the governing body of the Pollution Board that prevents it from really being very serious about pollution control?
I would like to ask a slightly speculative question. Is it possible to have some kind of an equipment that automatically monitors the heavy metals in the Vrishabhavati river and finds the people who are making such emissions?
I think that's putting a bit too much faith on technology. Certainly, we can improve monitoring technology where it would tell you those concentrations. But there are all kinds of practical complications. So my colleague Priyanka, we bought a 24-hour water sampler. It's basically something that picks up a sample in a bottle every hour and has place to store 24 bottles, right? So this is an automatic water sampler. We installed it next to the river, and lo and behold, 3 months down the road, it got washed away, because this river is prone to flash flooding. So at middle of the night, there was a flash flood, and although it was tied to a tree or something, it was just completely ripped off and taken away. So these are some very practical issues in our the idea of automatic monitoring. In the case of sewage, for example, domestic sewage, the biggest measure, the most important measure of pollution is BOD, biological or biochemical oxygen demand, and that by definition is a 5-day measure. So you pick the sample today, and then you have to measure it 5 days down the road to see what the biological oxygen demand is, BOD5 as it is called. So you cannot do it online, right? So there are many challenges to talking about online monitoring, and I think we have to always balance the technological and the social. So maybe we'll have better technology. Maybe we'll come up with proxy measures of BOD5 which are good enough to give us an indication of what's going on. We will probably never be able to keep monitoring all the way to the source, because there are 100 industrial units in the PDI industrial area. Who knows who's really doing the dumping? So it goes back to the human element. How do we monitor the human side, and how do we enable better enforcement? How do we enable or make people comply with the law better? Because we'll never be able to solve this through technology, right? Somebody will come up with a way to bypass your whatever pollution monitoring devices that you have. People are smart enough to do that. So we will never really beat the problem entirely with technology. We can improve certain things, but I think we have to also, in a country like India, if you look at the area around Pune, it's densely populated area. A lot of workers living there who work in those industrial units. So their lives depend on, are affected by pollution, but their livelihoods are affected by what happens to the industry. If you shut it down, that also affects them. So you have to really work with these communities. I think one of the big lacunae in the way our pollution control boards, or for that matter, all environmental regulators in India function, is that there is no idea of that they are doing it for the citizens, and therefore they should be doing it with the citizens. And of course, the recent wave is to focus a lot on technology. But as I said, we'll never be able to make the technology work unless we have enough people who are focusing on making it work, right? Whether it's the stakeholders, the local communities, and so on. So I think something has to be done in tandem, not with technology alone.
I understand. I like your point about mixing the technology with the social aspect and having a balance between the two. In a talk that you made at the fourth Open Science meeting in April 2019 in Switzerland, you spoke of a broader set of normative concerns in essential vision of a good society, such as sustainability, decent life and livelihoods, nature or spiritual well being, and equity and justice. Could you please elaborate on this idea?
So this goes back to my, as I said, the influence Ram Guha and others have had on me in terms of making me think about environmentalism, right? Or the idea of a good forest. What is a good forest? And coming up with this problem that your normative position, your value lens is what defines what is a good forest. And that is more generally true of the environment. That's more generally true of development. What is good development? How do we define that? These are all, in a sense, normative questions. And so it sort of led me to asking, what are the big normative principles by which we live? And that's, I think, been really useful, because if I talk to a conservationist or a biodiversity conservationist, wildlife or something, for them it seems to be that the only thing they want in life is save wildlife. And it's great. I mean, the passion with which they are approaching the question is great. But really, as a society, can you function with having only one goal, which is to save wildlife? Is alleviating poverty not a goal? Is equity in society not a goal in itself? Is ensuring that future generations also have not just wildlife, but also food to eat or water to drink? Is that also not part of societal goals? So this has kind of been the question that's been with me for forever, in a sense. One of the reasons why I moved away from, although I acknowledge my conservationist or wildlife roots, I don't consider myself, I don't say I'm a conservationist, I say I'm an environmentalist. And I use this question many times to my PhD students. Would you say you're a conservationist? Would you say you're an environmentalist? And so on. So I moved away from a narrow vision of society as, or my goal as only conservation, to environmentalism. And one of the things that I try to argue constantly is that ideas of equity and justice are actually very deeply embedded in the idea of environmentalism. And that's because everything that we do, act in, as human beings, right, has effects on the environment, and that in turn has effects on somebody else. Now, some of those effects may be long term, so we talk about sustainability. That if I, keep pumping groundwater today, eventually we'll run out of groundwater, and that's going to affect somebody maybe 20 years down the road or 10 years down the road. That's your standard notion of sustainability. We keep putting out CO2 in the atmosphere. 20 years down the road, the glaciers will melt. Actually, they're melting right now, so it's no longer about the future. But this idea of saving for the future generations. But that's not the only thing. I mean, when the guys in Pina industrial area dump heavy metals into the river, the farmer is receiving that water the next day and consuming that water for farming. It shows up in your baby corn, and you and I are eating baby corn Manchurian, probably laced with heavy metals when we buy it from Namdaris. So now, what kind of a problem is this? Or if I drive a very smoky vehicle, right, and somebody else is walking on the streets and breathing that smoky air, what kind of a problem is it? Is it an environment problem? Yes. But why is it a problem? And if you ask the person on the street, why is this a problem? What's the ethical issue here? They will say it's unfair. So the idea that one person's actions through the biophysical process impacting somebody else negatively, what we call in environmental jargon environmental externalities, is unfair, is a very deep understanding that people always carry with them. So it's not just about unsustainable. You can't say, oh, if Pina industrial area keeps dumping heavy metals, they will die 20 years from now. They won't die. Industry can keep flourishing for hundreds of years, dumping pollutants that get washed away downstream. Somebody else is dying today. So this idea that not everything is a problem of sustainability, although sustainability has today become kind of a umbrella concept that it's equal to environmentalism. The problem with using that umbrella concept is that we forget many of the justice dimensions. So this is unjust for an industry to be polluting a farmer's life, or it's unjust for me to be cutting trees upstream or in a forest if that's going to lead to siltation of a dam downstream, right? So these are about unfairness, injustice, not really about sustainability, because it's my benefit and your loss. And so we need to understand this from the lens of injustice and unfairness, inequity, and so on. If you bring water into Bangalore from 100 kilometers away from the Kaveri, now access to that water is still controlled by who can pay the water bill. In which case, there's a question of justice. Am I able to pay the water bill? Is the pipeline even showing up at my doorstep? Like I live in Kengeri, we don't even have Kaveri distribution system here, right? Am I entitled to it as a citizen of Bangalore? Yes. But do I get it? No. Let alone what is my ability to pay? That's like the social justice angle to it. So trying to unpack these ideas and then asking the question, where does biodiversity conservation fit in all this? Because a lot of environmental thinking is about other issues, energy, water, land, things that are of utilitarian value in some sense, or material value to your life. Where does biodiversity and wildlife fit into this whole thing? And so linking that to the spiritual well-being and saying that no, we need other species to survive, not because I will get some aphrodisiac from the tiger's parts, or I will get some medicines from the rhino's horn, or I'll get something else from medicinal plants, not just from that narrow utilitarian perspective, but because they have a right to live and they actually uplift our spirit, as Madhav has put it very nicely, that they will uplift our spirit. The presence of nature is uplifting. So there's a spiritual dimension of well-being, and that raises the whole question: then what do we mean by development? Does it mean just more money in my pocket? Does it mean more laptops in my house? Does it mean a 3,000 square feet house instead of a 1,000 square feet apartment? What is our definition of development, right? And that's the big contrast between the US and us in terms of the scale of material resource consumption that they have. Is that development, or should we call them not developed country but overdeveloped countries in some sense? So I think that's that inquiry as to what is development, what is a good life, and what are the components of a good life, which could include material well-being, spiritual well-being, not just for myself but for my neighbors, but for people far downstream or downwind, and for the future. Can we have this kind of a broader conception of what is, you can call it sustainable development, sustainable and equitable development, various terms, but with terms that each term has its own loading. So sustainable development is a very popular term, and one of the reasons why my paper written in 1991 as a grad student is even cited today, has become one of these citation classics, is simply because I try to unpack that term from these perspectives and say, what does it hide? What does it foreground? And it hides equity issues. It hides issues of democratic participation, where it only prioritizes sort of this vague notion of future generation and development, and equates development to economic growth. So these are some of the ideas that, for example, in a recent book that we did which was supported by this forum, Ernst Strungmann Forum in Frankfurt, where we brought about 40 researchers, academics from across the world to look at these questions of what is environmentalism, how do we think about a broader environmentalism in this way of sustainability, justice, and diversity as combined ideas of environmentalism. So that's been really something that has stayed with me, and I continue to kind of keep working on as I go along.
Sharad, could you please talk about democratizing forest governance? And could you please also talk about your books in this area? The one on democratizing forest governance in India and the other on community-based natural resources management.
So this is a nice juncture to ask this question about democratization, because I mentioned four things. I mentioned development as material well-being and spiritual well-being. I also mentioned sustainability and equity. So sort of this broad idea of a good society. But how do we get there? Or how do you even start getting there? And that raises questions of process, because your idea of material well-being or spiritual well-being cannot coincide with mine exactly. Even your idea, you may subscribe to ideas of equity and justice, and at the same time may think this is fair and something which I think slightly unfair, and so on and so forth, right? So how do we then as a society arrive at decisions about what is it that we want and what balance to strike as we choose strategies to get there? And that raises this question: do we then think of expert decision making? So I think all along in my IIT days or my masters, well into my PhD, I would say, I still essentially subscribe to the idea of scientists, doing pakka research, then figuring out what is good and bad for society, and telling decision makers, and then decision makers implementing those good decisions, right? And this is something we carry with us a lot. It's about science will tell you the right path forward. But frankly, I mean, science is only about the what is, and technology is maybe what can be, but that's not telling you what should be. So how do we arrive at the choice about what should be? And then you go back to either central planning, and again the recourse to experts, the whole idea of a planning commission and so on. But we have chosen to be a democratic society for a reason, and I think that reasoning is really that we will never know the right answer, and therefore we have to talk about this fifth goal or a fifth normative element, which is democratic decision making. And that the deeper the democratic decision making, the better it is, because all voices will be heard, and we'll find a path which looks like we're stumbling along, but it's better than a path where I know it all and I shove it down your throat. And I think this is a very core element, and it is a normative element in the sense somebody might say, no, I'm fine with a benevolent dictator. And there's, as you know, a huge Indian middle class which says, oh, Indira Gandhi's dictatorship was just fine because she, trains ran on time, government offices opened on time. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So, outcomes matter, process doesn't matter. And we're seeing the repetition of that even today for the last 5-7 years. That there's supposedly, if you just have a very strong government, everything will be fine. And a government which does not need any discussion or democratic process. So I think for me, the idea that we are a democratic society, and not just we, many societies have adopted this idea, is very important as a fifth value. And that ties in with my work on forests, because the forest question in particular has been a hugely contested question about what is a good forest. Or to put it differently, who is the forest for? Is it for me coming from Bangalore with my binoculars and my fancy car who wants to go to Nagarhole once in a few months or once a year to see the tiger? Or is it for the Adivasi who's been living there for thousands of years, but whom we want to kick out because somehow his presence makes it, not pristine? And so is the forest for me or is the forest for the Adivasi? So this question has been at the heart of the forest debate in India for 150 years, ever since the British colonial forestry model took over, where the Brits basically said the forest is for us, the colonial masters. And unfortunately, after independence, our government continued that concept. The forest is for the nation. And it's initially for nation building. So forest is for providing raw materials to industry. Then it is for conservation. So it's again, conservation in this broad sense. Tigers have to be saved because we, as in the urban elite, think tigers have to be saved. So that's when, forest is now serving that conservation purpose. Or it's for those downstream communities because upstream catchments have to be afforested. But you're not thinking about people who live in and around the forest themselves, and who have had this customary use for thousands of years, and good, bad, ugly, whatever it is. So I think at some level, a lot of the debate has been mischaracterized as, oh, but these people will mismanage the forest, and that's why we should not give them rights over the forest. And I have slowly reached the conclusion, not instantaneously, but over the last 20 years, that if I live in Bangalore, in a particular part of Bangalore, do I, as a citizen of Bangalore, have some right to have a voice in what happens to my environment? Whether a park gets constructed here, whether the Vrishabhavati should be clean or not, whether traffic should be reduced in some fashion or not. Do I, as a citizen, have a right to say something and do something about my immediate environment? Or should it be that somebody in Delhi or in some other capital is going to dictate how Bangalore should look? Right. So if I have a right as a Bangalore citizen, surely somebody who lives next to the forest and has been using the forest for hundreds of years has the primary right to manage the forest, to manage their environment. That's whether it's the forest, the water, the agricultural land, whatever it is. So I think this idea of deepening our democracy, which we really inherited from the Brits in some, what shall I say, half-baked fashion, we patched on the idea of democracy onto it, which is basically center and state. But each of our states is like a European country, right? The state of Maharashtra has more people than a whole bunch of European nations. So we need to go much below the state level, because we have had people living in these landscapes for thousands of years, and we've denied them the rights to manage their landscapes in the way they wanted, or to have the primary say in governance, even if you put in other layers of governance over and above that. So I think this idea of democracy, not just as voting power, but democracy as the daily practice of communities at the most decentralized possible level managing their lives. And I don't mean only forests or water, so environment is part of it, but even our social lives, right? The kind of say I have, or rather I don't have, in how the police behave in Bangalore is just unbelievable in a democratic society. I have no say in how the Pollution Control Board behaves, no say in how the police behave, no say in how a whole bunch of decisions get taken about our lives. And I think that is really central. So, as much as it's a technical question about the ecological understanding of forests, or it's a sociological, economic understanding of how people depend on forests and how they might benefit from using forests and so on, I think there is also a question of process of governance that's very central to all these issues. And I've carried over that idea into my work in other sectors, especially in the water sector, for example, where, as I said, when you unpack the behavior of the Pollution Control Board, at some point you realize that it's about the board not being sufficiently democratically accountable downwards to the people on whose behalf it is supposedly doing pollution control, right? Citizens have no say in what the board is doing in any direct way. So the ideas of sort of expanding that, as is this idea of democratization of environmental governance.
Sharad, could you also talk about your books in these areas?
Sure. So the Democratizing Forest Governance, one of my more recent books, 2014, where we were able to pull together a bunch of scholars who really thought about the forest question in depth in a variety of ways. And we called it Democratizing Forest Governance. Initially, we were thinking of some other titles, but really that struck a chord because it was less about the technicalities. If you look at the book, there are only a few chapters which have lots of tables and graphs and stuff like that. It's really about understanding process. How are we taking decisions about forests? What process is involved? What process should be really happening? So one of the key chapters there is obviously on the Forest Rights Act, and the Forest Rights Act is a landmark piece of legislation passed in 2006, and I've been working on that ever since, especially today, in terms of enabling its implementation, because it is a democratizing forest governance, in a sense that the title of this book is captured in the Forest Rights Act as it tries to change the colonial perspective. And so this book is really very close to what I'm doing right now in some sense. And other books have been kind of the book on community-based natural resource management. That's in a sense a precursor, because it doesn't directly talk about democratization. It talks about the idea that communities might be able to do a better job. And is that so? And when is that so? What kind of handholding do they need? Or what role do NGOs play in enabling that? We picked 6 cases of NGOs, including the well-known example of Hivre Bazaar in Maharashtra and Dudhatoli in the Himalayas and so on, to understand how the idea of sustainable and equitable natural resource management might be shaping up at the grassroots, and the limitations also in the way NGOs might be doing it or might be approaching the whole question.
Sharad, could you talk a little bit more about sustainable development and your award-winning paper, and about how your ideas in these areas have developed over the years?
So, as I said, this paper that I wrote in '91 was trying to synthesize what do we mean by this phrase, which had by then become quite popular with the Brundtland Commission's report in 1987, Our Common Future. They coined this phrase, sustainable development. And so it came at the right time. I mean, a lot of academic writing is about being in the right place at the right time. So it just happened to be a paper that was written at the right time, where I was trying to look at what this concept meant, how different people were using it, and what might be some of the lacunae or limitations of using it in particular ways. And this idea of sort of deconstructing and reconstructing the notion of a good society, of good development, of environmentally sound and socially just development. So how do we phrase the idea of a good society in a way that captures some of these key ideas of environmentalism, social justice? So there's been always a struggle, because you can't have a wording which is 10 words, a concept which is 10 words long, that you want society to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You can't really do that. So that's why terms like sustainable development become very catchy. In the process, they also lose some of these core concepts. So the book on, for example, rethinking environmentalism is sort of a culmination of many years of thinking on that same question of what is it that we mean by environmentally sound development? What is it what are some of the key dimensions of that? And what are the places at which these are at loggerheads? So what are the situations in which justice concerns are perhaps at loggerheads with sustainability concerns? The climate change debate is a classic example, right? So is climate change a sustainability problem, or a justice problem. And if you go to any extreme, you have, it's too simplified. So clearly, it is about the fact that if you continue to emit at this rate today, you will have, runaway climate change tomorrow, glaciers melting day after tomorrow, maybe, more droughts and floods as you go along, day after tomorrow, and so on. So that's you can say is a sustainability thing. Today's actions are affecting us in the future. But it's also a hugely justice question, because not everybody has been responsible for this change. Historical emissions from the quote-unquote developed world have been way more than those from developing countries. Even today, their contributions are the highest. Per capita emissions in the US are still at 18 tons of CO2 equivalent, and India is at 2 or 2.5 or 3. So whose contributions are the ones that really are creating this problem? And therefore, who will be able to solve this problem? I mean, India could completely shut down its emissions. I mean, if you do a thought experiment and say India is emitting 0 CO2 tomorrow, or however, we'll take the hit in whatever way it is, like shut down. Lockdown is a huge hit for us. Let's say you just completely shut down emissions. We are contributing 6% of global emissions. It will not make a zilch of a difference to what's happening to the climate, right? And yet we are being asked to now take on burdens of climate CO2 mitigation. We are being asked to reduce our carbon footprint when our carbon footprint is already at 2 or 2.5 tons per capita per year. So it's a clear issue of unfairness, environmental justice. Who's suffering? The first people who will suffer is small island states, who's will get submerged in the matter of next 10 years. Did they contribute to climate change? Not at all. These are small islands in the Pacific, or Lakshadweep or whatever, Maldives or somewhere. What was their carbon footprint? Nothing. Per capita also very low. Aggregate to pucho hi mat. Completely negligible. So, but they will be the first to suffer. So there's a huge justice damage to the whole thing. But we are really stuck because the sort of the two dimensions are, in a sense, at a loggerhead. The justice folks believe that if they only allow the sustainability people to dictate the show, then you will get a very unjust solution. And that's exactly what the Paris Accord is. It says we should all cut back. And everybody should cut back to the best of their ability. And then you have what you have, which is neither a very sustainable outcome, nor certainly a very just outcome. So it's in some ways a disaster. So I think this tension has been something that I really try to explore and understand as we go along in understanding environmental problems.
It's fascinating to learn about the balance between justice and sustainability. What are the everyday things that ordinary people can do to reduce their environmental footprint in general? Are there things that you would like us to do in terms of our lifestyle so that we minimally affect distant ecosystems?
I think that's a very good question, because I think when we say, okay, here are all our analyses, I mean, quote unquote, as scientists, often we do analysis of problems. We don't necessarily have solutions. Now, one needs to go back to one's engineering roots in some sense to say we also need to solve those problems. And it's going to be a combination of social engineering and technological change, right? And a huge amount of social engineering involved here. And within that idea of social engineering, you've got to break it up into sort of the micro and macro. So the first part of it is what can individuals do? And I think there's a lot we can do. First and foremost, acknowledge that there is a problem. I think that's a huge step that we have to take. Because right now we are still stuck in the mindset that, oh, I have to aspire for an American lifestyle. And that's legitimate, that's quite okay. And if anybody criticizes that, I'll say, oh, but I'm still nowhere near, my American contemporaries have 3 cars and go for a skiing holiday and whatever Hawaiian holiday every year, and I don't do that much. So I'm always saying, well, my footprint may be higher than the Indian average. Maybe it's 5. Maybe to give footprint as a measure of my environmental impact. The CO2 footprint is one measure. My footprint may be 6, 7. वो average American is at 18 यार, मेरे को क्यों चिल्ला रहे हो, and the rich American is at 50. तो मेरी क्या गलती है इसमें? मैं तो 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 तक चल रहा हूँ. And so I can always justify that. And that's one of the interesting things that one of my students is doing, is saying, but there are also regional environmental footprints. So the electricity I consume not only has a CO2 implication for the globe, but has an air pollution implication for India. Because air pollution does not spread across the globe. The thermal power plants in Korba and wherever the electricity is coming from to Bangalore and etc. or Raichur, the air pollution spreads of the order of tens of kilometers to maybe few hundreds of kilometers. Right. So some amount of the air pollution in Delhi appears to be contributed even from Korba in Chhattisgarh, but much more so from the surroundings of Delhi and of course from vehicular and other pollution within Delhi. So air pollution is also a problem. It's not just CO2. And if you look at these regional environmental problems, then I have to ask my question: is my lifestyle sustainable? It may be at 5 or 7 CO2 kind of footprint, but my local water footprint, my local air pollution footprint might be huge and completely unmanageable given how many people there are. And so again, we come to the equity and sustainability question. Should I measure by what impact I have today, or should I measure it by is my current level of consumption and emission extrapolatable to the population of India? Right? Because if I have a right to live at 5, everybody has a right to live at 5 and not be at 1 or half or whatever. Right? So the same thing is true for air pollution. If I have a right to drive a car, everybody has a right to drive a car. And then let's look at air pollution implications. So I think this what we can do is acknowledge there is a real problem, and then the problem is from a both sustainability and a justice point of view, that we can't continue to live like this into the future, and maybe we can. So this is the real challenge for us as the urban elite, upper class, is that actually we can. If there's air pollution outside, I'll put on ACs. I'll put my car on AC, right? So I take a taxi and go to work. So I solve that problem. I live in an air-conditioned house, so I've solved that problem. I live in an elite area with lots of trees, so I've solved again part of that problem. But that's not the way to look at the problem. That's not the only problem. The problem is that is not available to everybody else. And since we have a limited world, a limited India, a limited set of resources and whatever air sheds and watersheds, we have to make do with what we have, and we have to distribute it fairly, right? So this is where I think just the understanding of what is the problem and how serious and deep and how urgent it is for us, not just because the US is doing it and so on, but here we are consuming water. For example, my student calculated the water footprint of the average consumption basket or different levels of economic classes, and shows that really our daily use of water in our houses might be 200 liters per capita per day, but the embedded water footprint in the rice we eat, the vegetables we eat, and the other industrial products that we consume is at 2,000 liters or 3,000 liters per capita per day. And that water is coming either from the Gangetic Plain or from Kolar, which is already at 2,000 feet of groundwater levels. Other parts of the country, I don't even know where that product is coming from. The grapes I eat, the bananas I eat, or the cars that I consume, right? And how much water went into that from which water deprived watershed. So understanding that and seeing that really everything that we do has a footprint, and I need to cut back on that front. So there's a lot we can do in terms of reducing our personal consumption levels. But, and here is where the interplay between structure and agency, right? There's a lot that I can't do alone. So let's say I decide to go by public transport, but public transport is not available, or not available at a level of decency where I don't run the risk of basically, hanging from the edge of the bus every day. I did commute to work by public transport for 5-6 years, and so I know the experience of trying to get a seat in a BMTC bus at 6 p.m. coming back, and essentially fighting everybody else in order to even get into the bus, right? So if I don't define that as a good standard of living, and say that public transport should be available at a decent level, then that's not something I can individually solve. I can get rid of my car, but then the only option I have is bicycling, and I'd get killed on the roads. So, or I couldn't go 30 kilometers anyway by bicycle every day. So then what's the option? Public transport. But what is the level of public investment in public transport? Very pathetic, considering the size of the problem that we have. So I think that's where we as individuals need to think beyond just individual change and into social change. So individual change includes also changing the way we live in society, and actually agitation is part of individual change in some sense. So I want to say that yes, we need to change individual consumption expectations of what is a good lifestyle. Not say that I have a right to a holiday in Bangkok or whatever, Dubai every year. I don't have a fundamental right to that. Or maybe not even to Nagarhode, depending upon the situation. But also that just by giving up that is not going to be enough. I'll have to change the way I behave as a citizen in this democratic country by taking on a huge role in terms of pushing for change in the structures. Whether it's investing in public transport, tightening environmental regulations, better distribution of water, or what have you. So I think it won't happen just like that. Just by saying, okay, I've given up, my water consumption has come down, I've done my job. No, I don't think I've done my job. So that goes to the issues of environmental governance and policy, which is where a lot of my work has now focused.
So Sharad, what public policy changes would you like to see in order to protect the environment?
I think that's a really big question. Obviously, I'd like to see, first of all, again, at a public policy level, an acceptance of that we want to live in an environmentally sound and socially just society. And I think today we are really moving very quickly away from that idea. We're paying lip service to environment. To give you a very hilarious example, I was on some Ministry of Environment committee for the last 2-3 years. And so once I went to Delhi to the Paryavaran Bhavan, and I saw a horde of school kids there, doing something in their uniform, standing there erect and hearing some bhashan and all that. So I asked the officer in the ministry, "Bhai, ye kya chal raha hai?" He said, this was month of October, so the air pollution problem in Delhi was huge, right? As you've heard, every October, November, the issue pops up in a big way. So the problem was really huge. So what are these kids doing? I said. He said, "Oh, shapath le rahe hain." They are taking an oath to be clean citizens, to be less polluting citizens. I think wow, that's a very interesting solution to a very complicated environmental problem. Just get people to take oaths. But that's what we have reduced environmentalism to, right? Our concern for environmentalism is to these token gestures towards having done something, maybe swept my front yard or something like that. But really, the problems are much deeper. So engaging with this idea of environmentally sound and socially just development. So embracing this idea of environmentally sound and socially just development and saying we have to live within our limits. And it doesn't matter whether the Americans are at some level. It matters in international negotiations to demand a rightful share of the climate change accord in some sense. But at the same time, there is a huge bunch of environmental and resource problems locally that should drive our thinking, and we have to live within these resource limits, environmental limits, and live in a fair manner. And I think even just embracing that idea and saying, no, I don't think SUVs is a environmentally sound way of functioning. I don't know if you remember this, but Jairam Ramesh, when he was environment minister, he actually just vaguely floated this idea that can we ban SUVs from entering Delhi, or put taxes on higher taxes on the sale of SUVs. And my goodness, the hell broke loose, because the Chatterati, the upper middle class, is aspiring to have that SUV, right? They feel they have a birthright to that SUV. If they have money in their pocket, they have a right to the SUV. Baat khatam hui. I have negotiated my salary package with my IT company for the next level, which would exactly enable me to buy that next SUV. Or tum sare beech mein aake ye, you're talking all this socialist and communist nonsense about people not having rights to SUVs. So I think that's still very deep in our country. And we need to change that discourse at the policy level. And only then we'll be able to change the institutions of environmental governance from the top to the bottom. From the top to the bottom. As I said, the idea of deepening democratic accountability is something that applies everywhere, whether it's your water agency, whether it's your pollution guys, whether it's forests, whatever it is. But along with that, I think this whole environmental regulatory process, making it much more transparent, making it more science-based. I mean, I've been serving on these ministry committees and just seeing how process can be perverted in so many different ways. At the end of the day, nothing will change, right? And that's, at some level, that's a really deep question for us. Are we really serious about process? Not just democratic process, even the way committees function. There's lack of democracy within committees. There's lack of accountability and transparency within committees. It's just amazing. So I think that's really one of the core ideas here.
So Sharad, if I understand what you said, a lot of these changes are not sudden overnight changes. They are changes that can only happen over a fairly long period of time, because a lot of these ideas have to percolate down to social consciousness, and it is something that can never happen overnight. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say percolate down, because that sort of sounds like putting myself too much on a pedestal. I think at some level, the germ of these ideas is there across society. And I think the simpler people's lifestyle, or maybe slightly more engaged with nature, or slightly less carried away by modern materialism, I think there is a germ of these ideas. But of course, we are also a very deeply divided society on caste lines, class lines, and so on. So yes, it is going to be a long process. I would say lateral diffusion of these ideas. There's a whole bunch of actors, whole bunch of committed people who have worked for these goals. At the end of the day, I'm generating knowledge for change. There are many other change makers who are really out there on the front lines, slogging away. To whom I owe a huge debt, because their work inspires us to try to produce some knowledge that will support their work in some sense. And I think there are thousands of them, but of course we need millions. So yes, the lateral diffusion will take time.
So interesting to hear about lateral diffusion. So how did your views on social sciences evolve over the years? So could you also please explain the following that you spoke about at the 2016 talk at the University of Waterloo in Canada, about the kind of knowledge that is needed to tackle environmental problems, the nature of interdisciplinarity, and the disciplinary pyramid that was proposed by Manfred Max Neef, and also the book that you have written in this area?
So one of my side interests, and I think that developed because of my exposure to the energy and resources group in Berkeley, was the question of interdisciplinarity. What do we really mean by that? And why do we want it? Because that energy and resources group is an absolute champion of doing interdisciplinary research on the environment, and I am also. And my PhD work really inculcated that idea in me. But it also made me reflect. What is this thing that I'm pushing initially down my throat, and then later on down my students' throats, or wherever else that I can propagate the idea. And so I've written a lot about interdisciplinarity, including this book that you mentioned, which is an edited volume with several others, emerging from a workshop of the first workshop of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics, of which I am a founding member. And the idea is really that interdisciplinarity itself is not like, what shall we say, always good. It is good in certain contexts. Disciplinary knowledge building is also important, because in a sense, discipline is about keeping your focus and building upon past knowledge in order to produce future knowledge, and staying rigorous within the confines of that particular area of work. We need interdisciplinarity because we are trying to solve problems. You can disciplinarily analyze one slice of a problem. So you can say, for example, that you can go out and measure heavy metals in the Vrishbhavati river and conclude that yes, there is a problem. But that measurement will not tell you why the metals are being let out by particular industries, or why the pollution board is not able to prevent those industries from doing that. So it's this, that if you want to solve the problem, you'll need to understand the whole range of the problem, from its biophysical manifestations, maybe human health manifestation at the end, to its social behavioral origins, maybe the economic incentives that they get, maybe it's the political science question of how we have structured the pollution control board, etc. So it sort of made me realize that this is why really I'm talking about interdisciplinarity, because I want to solve problems. So knowledge for change. And that's where the Manfred Max Neef's pyramid. So Max Neef is a Chilean philosopher, was a Chilean philosopher. Also worked very intensively on the ground in slums in Chile. And he's written some really interesting stuff, one of which is this idea of what is it to be interdisciplinary, what is the nature of disciplines, and the relationship between them. So I used to think of disciplines as these different, you can say, islands in an ocean of ignorance. That's one imagery I use. So each discipline is an island in an ocean of ignorance, and our job sitting on that island is to push back the seas of ignorance till eventually all the islands will merge and the whole continent of knowledge will emerge in some sense. But that's a very oversimplified idea of knowledge and discipline and so on. So Max Neef has a very interesting argument. He says, at one level, you can talk about disciplines that explore what is, that they explain, and the sciences, the pure sciences, and not just the natural, but also the social sciences. So sociology might explain how people behave. or economists might try to explain why people buy certain things and don't buy other things. And chemistry and physics, explains why whatever atoms behave in particular ways or apples fall to the ground. So they're explaining, but they are not actually doing anything with that knowledge. So you have a next level, which in the sense are what we would call applied sciences, and in which he puts both engineering as well as applied economics and so on, where he says, or for that matter, farming. He says farmers are drawing upon not just biology, soil science, but also economics to figure out what's the best crop to grow, right? So farmers, engineers, architects, these are all the guys who are actually applying the science. So that he talks about the next level of what you can do with the knowledge. So it's about what is and what can be. So the second level is what can be. So you can build a building. So the architect is dreaming of this skyscraper or whatever, ecologically friendly house by drawing upon the material science guy and the the guy who talks about the physics of buildings and blah blah blah, right? So, and ergonomics. Yeah, people have to live in that building. So, and then he says this is the second level, but they're just producing different options. But who's to decide which option to choose? So he's talking about a third level, and there he puts sort of the political process, the planners, the political leaders, all in that third process of what should be, right? In the sense of choosing. So what can be, and then what should be done. And then he puts the fourth level, which he calls the philosophers. And he says the philosophers are asking us to question the what should be, the why. So the philosophers are asking the question why. Why is it right to do this versus that? Why is it right to politically opt for a democracy versus to opt for a dictatorship? So philosophers are asking all these questions, right? So he's very nicely sort of these layers in his pyramid. The reason he says pyramid is because there's a very few philosophers and tons of people doing the bottom layer. Is this Max Neef pyramid that I've used in my teaching to say that where are we as knowledge producers, but we are producing knowledge for change. So we are somewhere sort of the interface between the first layer and the second layer. We are feeding, and third layer also, we are feeding our knowledge to the change makers. And change makers could be a variety of them. Individuals, NGOs, governments, city corporations, whatever, or companies for that matter. And I think this has really been very useful for me to kind of organize my understanding of disciplines and interdisciplinarity. So what does interdisciplinarity mean? So Max Neef is saying farmers are interdisciplinary, engineers are interdisciplinary, architects are interdisciplinary. And so a bad engineer would be somebody who's not sufficiently interdisciplinary. And I would say their IITs could do a better job because they could make us understand that we are really trying to draw upon disciplines to make something which has to be socially useful. And so what are the criteria of social usefulness? Is it only saleable in the market? Is that the only criterion? Right? That next car which is cheaper or whatever, bigger or faster or more efficient or whatever it is, are those the only criteria that we should be using? So Max Neef's ideas then will make us ask all those questions, right? Why it should be? What should be? What kind of car should I be even trying to innovate? And I think that's the advantage of using that discipline. And this has come after, I mean, my ability to even I read Max Neef's paper in 92 when it was published, and it didn't make any sense to me, to be honest, at that time. But it's come after many years of kind of struggling to be interdisciplinary myself, struggling to understand the social sciences. And that's been a big struggle, again, because as engineers, in spite of IIT having one of the better humanities and social science departments probably in the country in terms of, engineering schools, I mean, you know very well that the approach that we have towards HSS is one of those faltu courses that we are forced to take because whatever silly reason. And how do I minimize the time I spent on that course and somehow get by and not have to really worry about it ever afterwards? Maybe if you are slightly inclined, you enjoy Econ 101 up to a point. It used to be, I think, Econ 301 in my days, and so on. But that's about it. So economics is kind of closer to engineering. It is mathematical. It is seen as quote unquote rigorous, and we bring that in because also you can't just sell, you can't just make any damn car and expect to sell it, right? It's got to be economically viable. You can't expect to sell something for 20 crores. So that's kind of why we think economics is fine. And our understanding of the social sciences is often just limited to economics. And I think that's a huge lacuna in our education. And that is, of course, partly driven by how the social sciences have evolved, but largely to do with how the society has treated the social sciences, whether it is sociology, anthropology, political science, or the applied social sciences, psychology, behavioral sciences, management streams, organizational theory. We say, oh, OD is something you learn in management school. No, OD is something you should be learning in IIT, in BTech, because tomorrow you will be in some organization. You might join the electricity board, you might join, BPL, or some IT company, Infosys. Everywhere, organizations are what you're going to join, and maybe tomorrow what you're going to create. And so you need to know something about OD. So I think that understanding it can be a very long time to even understand the importance. It's not that I've been formally trained in any of those disciplines. I know almost nothing about most of them. I always joke that I know more social science than the average natural scientist and engineer in the room. And I know more natural science and engineering than the average social scientist in the room. So that's kind of my specialty. But I think we really need to rework our perspective on the social sciences and give it the credit and the importance that it's due in our lives. And not just the social sciences, as Maxine would say, the humanities sit right at the top in terms of philosophy and history and so on, trying to understand things from a ethical lens and so on. So I think that's also missing in our education hugely. So
that's a very interesting perspective, Sharad. Sharad, your friends from H5 and IIT Bombay remember you a lot for your clarity of thought, classical music, bird watching, your interest in wildlife and trekking, your tenures as garden secretary, general secretary, and they also remember what they call as the Lele Garden at H5. And they also remember you a lot for what you call as signing out of the rat race, which they kind of got to know during the allocation of the BTech project, when you actually took a project which was very much offbeat, considered offbeat at that point in time. And your friends are in complete awe of you, Sharad. So, Sharad, your life and work is a great source of inspiration for all of us. I have learned a lot on environmental issues, during this discussion with you. As you rightly said, as an electrical engineer myself, my natural instinct is to think about voltage and currents and not about the environment. So I would agree that perhaps much more stronger grounding in social sciences, would make us understand some of these issues, much better. So it's been really wonderful to talk to you, Sharad, and thanks a lot for spending the time. And as I said earlier, this has been a very educative discussion for me in order to understand many of these issues.
Thanks a lot, Vivek. I think it's been really fantastic for me also to link sort of reflect back on my path and my serendipitous discoveries of what is my passion and then follow it wherever it took me. And I think to an extent, a lot of my colleagues, I'm in awe of them, whether it is, Mahesh Mehendale, who's in TI as a fellow, or Arun Chandavarkar, his work at Biocon and so on. They actually stayed true to their engineering in some sense. Many of us kind of drifted off, some of us purposefully, others maybe not. I used to always say this in IIT when people said, oh, you're doing a great job as whatever, this or that, general secretary and so on. I would keep repeating that it's not about ability, it's about passion and commitment. I think that I still stand by that. I think in IIT, we put a whole lot of weight or emphasis on, my JEE rank as a reflection of my intellectual ability, my silver medal as a reflection of my intellectual ability. And therefore, intellectual ability as being the most important thing, whether I measure it through these ranks or through my ability to solve crossword puzzles very fast or whatever it is. But that idea of intellectual ability is what matters. And I actually have come to believe that it is not only about intellectual ability. It's hugely about our commitment. And if we are committed, we can do anything.
So that's great to hear, Sharad. So on that note, thank you very much and looking forward to see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Same here. Thanks, Vivek.